nurse from Sturgeon Bay. Been here, gosh, hard to believe, 32 years.
And I'm Laura Kai. I'm from Sturgeon Bay, from originally Green Bay, and I'm the Adult Services Librarian.
Yep.
10 years.
And Laura's the one who put me onto this book. And she had a number of choices. I read a little bit, and I read some reviews, and I said, we have to do it. We have to do it. I'm going to do some introductory remarks, quickly summarize the book and set the context of this book. I've done a little research on this. Zora Thurston was a student at the time when she interviewed Cudjo. And she was going to Columbia at the time and working toward a degree in cultural anthropology. And she didn't graduate from Columbia. She attended Columbia. She attended, I'm trying to think. Well, she graduated from Barnard. She was the first African American to graduate from Barnard. She was, so she interviewed Cudjo Lewis in 1927. And here's what she said to Cudjo. Her exact words I got from the book. She says, "I want to know who you are and how you came to be a slave, and to what part of Africa do you belong, and how you fared as a slave, and how you managed as a free man." I was from page 19. So she built the book really around that. And when you look at the book, there's really sort of four parts to it. There's where Cudjo is growing up in West Africa. Now it's called Benin, B-E-N-I-N, that's the area in West Africa. His capture, just gruesome information about that, and also certainly you learn about how Africans played a huge part in one tribe capturing other people. And the reason they did that were money and wealth and power. So you learn about his capture. You learn a little bit about his life as a slave. One chapter in the entire book about his life as a slave. And then the last chapter is his life in Jim Crow South. So that's sort of how the book is structured. Zora Hurston wrote this book between 1927 and 1931. She tried to get it published. No one wanted to publish it. The closest she got it published was with Viking Press. But Viking said, you have to take that dialect out and replace it with King's English. And Zora said, absolutely not. It's what gives the book its character, its authenticity. And thank goodness she said that. Now, she never saw the book published in her lifetime. It was shoved aside, but never was lost. This wasn't like a lost manuscript. It ended up at Howard University, where that's the other university she attended, in the archives. 2 years ago, her grandniece was looking through the archives, looking for things of Zora Thurston's that were not published, and found the book, and then went on from there. Just a few words about Zora Hurston. I did some really fun reading about her. And if you want to learn more about her, there's this film out called Zora Neale Hurston, Jump at the Sun. And you'll see a very,
is that a library?
that's from the library
But
here.
I did have to get it from another system, so.
Yeah, but I recommend it. What you're going to see is a very flamboyant, fun, exciting moment.
Yeah.
That's what you're going to find. It's part of the Harlem Renaissance. So she was hooked up with Langston Hughes, a bunch of those people. She was rubbing elbows with some really, really wonderful writers. In her lifetime, she wrote a lot. That's what she did. She wrote plays, essays, short stories, 50, that's over 50. She wrote, I think this count is right, 4 novels. And the one that's been most well received prior to this is Your Eyes Were Watching God. This book is now being read in universities. As I mentioned before we started, she was opposed the New Deal, opposed Brown versus Board of Education, opposed any form of welfare. She said, look what I can do on my own. That was her basic argument. She was quite well known when she was writing, and then over time her books went out of print, and her livelihood went with it. So as I mentioned before we started, she ended up as a maid, returned back she went to Fort Pierce, Florida, and ended up working as a maid, among other things, and ended up in a county welfare home, and that's where she died at age 69 of heart disease. I believe she was a lifetime smoker. We owe her rescue to Alice Walker. Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple, went down to Fort Pierce, Florida, and found her unmarked grave, bought a headstone, and that was the beginning of her comeback. Finally, and I'll be done, to put this in context. In 1607, that's when Jamestown was formed. 12 years later, our first slaves landed in this country at Jamestown. A Dutch ship brought over 20 slaves. 2 years later, we had our first legal slave owner, a guy called Anthony Johnson, who was African American. He was an indentured servant, got his freedom, had a 250-acre plot in Virginia, and bought slaves. And it was deemed to be a legal act. Our first slave ship was called the Desire, built in 1637. Well, the reason I'm doing this is slavery and the slave trade has been with us a really long time. In 1637 was our first slave ship, and ships like the Desire brought, the numbers really vary, anywhere, or call it around 6 to 7 million human beings.
Wow.
Through the 18th century. That's just the 18th century. Some people will disagree with those numbers, but that's sort of the number. And to be bought, sold, or what have you. See, we sit here, we are all children of immigrants, but none of our great-great-grandfathers, grandparents came across in a slave ship. The slave ships were originally built to ship cargo. In the hold, you had about 2.5 feet. 2.5 feet. When you're down there, I get claustrophobic thinking about it. From 1774 to 1804, all the northern states abolished slavery and the slave trade, but that still left the southern states. Thomas Jefferson, a slave, of course, a huge slaveholder, in his State of the Union address, which in those days they didn't speak them, they wrote them, in his State of the Union address of 1806, called for the termination, not of slavery, but of the slave trade. A year later, a law was passed in 1807, saying that slaves cannot be brought to this country. It didn't stop the buying and selling of slaves within our country. But you know, even though there's a law from 1807, slaves kept getting brought to this country. Kept coming. It's estimated about 50,000 of them came after 1807. Jumping forward quickly to January 1st, 1863, very important date in our history. We know what that is, right? Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. You know, it was an executive order, so it did not outlaw slavery. It didn't give citizenship rights to slaves. It was an executive order, freeing slaves. But right before Lincoln died, if you've ever seen the movie, it's a great, great movie. The Congress passed in January of 1865, 4 months before Lincoln's death, the 13th Amendment. Then it goes out to the states to get ratified. By the end of 1865, all forms of slavery are outlawed, and then we enter the Jim Crow South. And we've heard the stories of the Jim Crow South, and that's where Cudjo spent most of his life. He was 19 years old when he was brought to this country. And it's hard to get his exact birth dates and what have you. But best we know, he was born about 1840, give or take. We know for sure he died in 1935. And is buried in which is called Africatown, Plateau, Alabama, a suburb of Mobile, Alabama. He's buried there. That's a quick overview. One last word. I found this to be a powerful, powerful book. Let's say once you get through the dialect. Because, and I mentioned this before in some of our history discussions, when you read history written by a history professor, most often, not always, but most often, the affective component is stripped away. So if you read about slavery, there's very little emotion. But when you read this book, the emotion is there. And when Cudjo, who's being interviewed, talks about tears running down not only his face, but the inside of himself. Day after day, all of a sudden, it takes on a meaning that I don't think you can ever get from reading straight history. It's so authentic and so powerful. That's my take on the book. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Okay, that's the. I guess my first question, just to get us rolling in when we pick this up, is how did this book move you in any way? And if yes, how did it move you? Yeah.
I listened to it, so
yeah.
I heard the dialect. I had no trouble with it at all.
Yeah.
I have lived 8 or 9 years in West Africa, so the rhythms of the African speech were familiar. I loved the animal stories at the end of it, because we heard those animal stories when in the Peace Corps village I lived in. The monkey always outsmarts all the other animals. And although we were probably 700 to 800 miles away from Dahomey or Benin, it was the same thing, the same rhythms in the speech, the same cleverness of certain animals and the stupidity of other animals. I loved that. I was moved by the horribleness of slavery and by I'm not mincing any words, the Africans did it to themselves, at least initially. And I'm reminded of James Monroe at one point had a plan to free Africans and send them back to Africa, and
Yeah.
the group settled in Monrovia. And within a year after they had landed and settled, they had enslaved the people. They came with their top hats and their Bibles. And
Yeah,
certain Western exterior to themselves. They had lawyers and physicians and preachers, and they made slaves of the people they encountered. And that is well studied by Liberian school children, and so I'm assuming it's true, or they would, well, I shouldn't say absolutely true, but they certainly found they needed laborers because it was the elite that had gone, and the well-educated that had been sent back to what was then West Africa, now is Nigeria. And they enslaved people to build the farms and build their homes, etc.
and
So
that's so,
the idea of subjugating other folks is not unique to white folks.
yeah,
It's surely us, we surely possess it,
yeah.
but maybe mankind itself has it.
You gotta wonder about that, no?
Yes. But anyway, I did enjoy the book. It moved me on two levels. First of all, the first part, the horrendousness of his capture, his life as a slave, which was short, and then his Jim Crow life, where his
Yeah,
children die one after the other, and the train that deals with the train accident and the legal system and et cetera.
what I remember is one of his children was shot by the sheriff,
Yep.
who happened to be the pastor of the church too, right?
I don't remember that, but it could well be.
But I believe he was shot
Shot the head off, didn't he?
in the head,
Yeah, and the head was.
yeah. But what part I learned in the book was the way the slaves in Africa were captured.
That whole business about society in Africa and the kings and that whole thing was totally new to me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
tell the people.
Well, and I certainly can't recall in detail or correctly exactly how it worked, but, I'd never read about that before, how Africa's society was organized, and it certainly had quite an organization. But,
Yeah.
They had a well-developed society.
yeah.
It was primitive. They didn't have, I don't think they had a wheel yet.
They had like kings, and-
Kings and
Kings of-
armies, vast armies.
Yeah. In fact, Cudjo was trained to be a warrior at age 14,
Yeah.
and he was in training for 5 years.
After 14 rainy seasons, he then became a
Yeah, yeah.
soldier.
And, am I pronouncing it correctly? Dahomey? Dahomey, or?
The French say Dahomey.
Dahomey. The king of Dahomey is the one who organized the capture of Cudjo.
Yes.
And it gave that king wealth. See, the slaves were sold for about 50 to 60 bucks a piece.
In other words, black people were selling other black people.
Exactly.
Capturing,
Exactly.
torturing,
Exactly.
And so that
And
gave
fattening
wealth
up.
to the king,
and
but
power.
also with wealth, what else comes? Prestige and power.
And with wealth, they were able eventually to buy weapons, more Western weapons, some sort of flintlock guns or some,
Yeah,
some very
exactly.
primitive weapons, which only increased their power, because that was better than a spear.
Yeah, so it's like spiraling upward of power. And then, of course, then the slaves would be brought on a slave ship to this country. And when it was done legally, when it was done illegally, after 1807, they always ended up in Texas or Florida. That was the point of entry. When it was done legally, they could end up in Virginia or what have you. And then the slaves, when it's done legally, slaves would be brought here, and they would be inspected like a piece of meat. And then plantation owners and the like would basically bid, auction bid for what they considered to be people who were not human. They were like merchandise. It is, it's the blackest stain I think we have in our country. And
And
certainly our country wasn't alone, but there certainly were at the time.
Wasn't it originally
Many-
British and Dutch?
Yeah, it goes way, way back. Goes back to Egyptian days. Slaves have been around.
Was it The King of the Belgians and the Heart of Darkness? or-
Say it again, Laura.
The book, The Heart of Darkness, what was that?
Joseph Conrad?
Yeah, which.
I think it was Belgium.
Belgian, yeah, I think the Belgians were the.
And we talk about slavery going back to Slavic
Go ahead.
times. Because he talks in the book, he says the term slave originally captive, historically associated with the Slavic people in Eastern Europe. And also this idea that it's unique because black people sold to other black people. The Southwest American Indians captured other Indians, slaves, and sold them back and forth as well.
So that's, yeah.
So, it's not condoning it, it's just saying that,
Oh, yeah, slavery goes back to ancient times,
I
the
think
Greeks.
it's biblical.
Oh, in the Bible, Hebrews.
And
Yeah.
you can see why they had to train the kids, 14 to be warriors, because if you didn't, you were out of luck. Even then they were captured.
But the decapitation,
They had to.
the decapitalization is the thing that got me, cutting off the heads and carrying them around bush trophies and so forth.
Yeah, and then smoking the head because it smelled too bad.
Right?
Yeah.
And,
So we saw his relatives' heads.
you know what the one that got me, Bill? It's when it was Cudjo's own tribe, and there was a leopard killed. And the leopard was brought to his king. And the king says, there's one piece of hair from the hide missing. One piece, whatever you call it. And then the person who the king argued did it was beheaded. Over,
A whisker, I.
a whisker, that's
A whisker,
the
yeah,
whisker.
what you said here.
I was
Yeah,
looking
whisker,
for the
yeah.
word, thank you, Jim. I couldn't quite
I was
pull
gonna
it.
say, a piece of hair would be tough, but
No,
yeah,
it'd be
which one's
a whisker.
He said, I see the hole where it belongs,
Yeah.
where it came from.
Yeah,
Was that the king exercising his total power, saying, I own the entire leopard, even down to the last whisker? What is that? I couldn't get what that represented to the king. Why?
Wasn't there something about poison?
I
Is
think
that
what you,
true?
go ahead.
Wasn't there something about poison in the whisker that,
I can't remember that.
Can't remember either.
I don't know.
so they figured that the person who saved that whisker was out to do somebody in, somebody else in? Well, anyway,
It did indicate the total power of the king over his
Yeah.
subjects,
Yeah,
even his own tribe.
yeah.
These are kind of complicated because I think they're done under a sense of a justice system that exists that's a different culture than what we're used to.
Exactly.
But we still go through that. There's still an argument right now over capital punishment, for instance, and what should be done to that. So it's still within this society too, but it was administered under a little different terms at that particular point.
Yeah, a
But it
little
still
different,
was-
yeah.
In
Yeah,
process,
but it
was
still
something
was
special.
the justice system that was there and that was accepted and understood. And this guy that took that whisker certainly knew what he was up against as far as that concept is concerned. So I don't know how to react to that when it's cross cultures like this was. And the same way with the enslaving, and you talked about these other examples of which different cultures did take slaves, but they were rarely done within their own group. It was either somebody that they had a grievance against, or an enemy of some kind, or something else that was captured and then sold into slave traders was a fairly common kind of a result of that type of an action. So it seemed to be, as I gathered, a similar kind of a thing in here, that the king that captured these slaves, or Cudjo was captured, it was by another tribe other than his own.
That's
And then he was
typically
taken
what
from
happened.
that, and the same with the beheading that was done by other tribes against his, so.
That's also true.
Yeah, so it's complicated, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, the other thing I thought is the relative small amount who survived Indignant.
Tell us
On the
more
ship.
about that, Bill.
Well, I don't remember the numbers, but the numbers are, relatively small. In other words, once you're captured, your percentage of surviving to be got here is fairly small. Forgot what the number is, but I thought it was small.
Yeah,
Well, and the demeaning idea of taking away their clothes.
Yeah,
Just totally taking away anything that they knew and making animals out of them.
and also talk about the thirst. We felt on the long, 70 days, was it?
70 days. On the name of the ship was called the Clotilda, and it was a very fast ship. But there was only one good aspect of this whole thing. That ship had 5 feet in the hold, rather than 2.5 feet. So, in relative terms, it was more comfortable, and probably, in relative terms, a higher survival rate. I think the number was 115 came
It
over
had
in
to be
that
an
ship.
even number, because they talked about equal numbers of males and females when
Yes.
aboard. So,
Which I wondered about.
well, I think that idea of that is to procreate what's to the other side.
Okay,
So that in most cases when the slaves became sold, didn't they say somebody bought 2 men and 2 women, and somebody else bought 4 men and 4 women? But the other one, they got on the Mobile River, and
so
So-
this way they
yeah,
could,
they were buying 2, but within a year or 2, there might be 3. Within a generation, you'd have,
so it's like a breeding mentality.
yeah, I didn't want to use that word, but
That's what, I mean,
it's assuring procreation.
yeah, but if that's sort of what's in their mind, you do that with
It's
cows.
finance,
you
if
do
the
with
dollar
sheep.
signs were ringing as
Why
they
not
made
do
that
it with
decision.
human beings?
And that's what they did. It was, if you had horses, you have stud books. And you take the stud books and you find out who are the best producers. And the slave owner did the same thing.
They did the exact same.
They did exactly. But one thing I've never been able to figure out is why they treated them so poorly. If you have good horses, you really take care of them. And that was their labor source.
Perhaps it has to do with the need to, it's such an unnatural state, and the need to dominate, and the way you can show one's domination,
To assure subjugation, yeah.
subjugation, yeah.
Must have been provided with some food.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, so,
I think he was treated pretty well by his owner. It was after he was freed that they said, okay, I'm all done with you.
Yeah, but didn't his owner give him new shoes at one point?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
refused to give him land, but
yeah.
gave him
Yeah.
shoes and something else.
the, let's work backwards on that. There were, Captain Forster,
Yes.
he's the one who captained the ship, and there were 3 brothers, Mayer brothers, who put this whole thing together and had the ship built. And when Cudjo came back, he was enslaved by one of those three Mayer brothers, and he worked on a ship as a deckhand. That was he was in captivity for about 5.5 years. The book told this story, which I'm sure could be told many times. So, after the 13th Amendment is passed, all the slaves are free.
Yeah.
But then what? Then what?
Jim Crow.
What was wasn't there a 40 acres and a mule somewhere? Slaves were
That
supposed to
was
get.
for the soldiers, the Confederate Army.
That's
That
exactly
Oh,
right.
it wasn't the
It
slaves.
was
So
the
Cudjo
enemy.
goes to his owner, past owner, one of the Mirrors, and he also goes to the captain of the ship and says, hey, can you get me back to Africa? And he said, absolutely not. Well, can you give me land? Absolutely not. So what Cudjo did is work the sawmill, the powder mill, etc. And it's an amazing story. He and others saved money. And they started their own town, Africa Town. And in that town, they not only built a Baptist church, which I believe is still there, they ended up building a school. And the town, now it's just part of a suburb of Mobile,
The town
Alabama.
sent a teacher.
And what?
The town sent a teacher after, but they had to first build the building.
Tell us more about that, yeah.
I don't know, I was confused by that, why the town would have bothered to send a teacher.
I don't know either.
But that was a generous gesture, I would suspect, by that municipality to,
Yeah,
I'm gonna guess this was 1910 or so, or maybe earlier, to
Yeah.
teach African, black children?
I don't know. After the 13th Amendment, there were, this is a part of our history that a lot of us don't know. Down south, there were many all-black towns. All black, completely black. And this is one of the many towns.
And Zora Neale Hurston grew up the daughter of a mayor
Of a black town.
so maybe that's why she was against the New Deal and felt she was self-sufficient, because she grew up in a
No, that's so good.
hierarchy that had her at the top.
Yeah.
Well, the New Deal may never have done anything for those people.
I'm sorry?
The New Deal policies may have never affected or done anything for those people.
Probably, I think, I see where you're going with that, yeah. So maybe that's why she wasn't too excited about a New Deal that never affected her. Maybe.
It's also interesting on the census, 1900, 1910, 1920, Cudjo owned his own house completely, no mortgage. So-
Also, no, Laura's fantastic. You know what she digs up?
I just
How did you, I say, how the hell did you find that? In 1867, Cudjo is on the voter registration.
Yeah, that's right here.
Yeah.
Ancestry.com.
How did you find that, Laura?
It's genealogy research, I just look at the resources we have here. But it's pretty amazing because one other place mentions that he was, became a citizen in 68, but the dates are all fuzzy, so the fact that he was voting at 67 makes me think he would have been made a citizen and then registered right away.
Yeah, because he had to go through the naturalization process, the other slaves didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's has to be a record someplace in his naturalization.
Yeah, well, that's what this is,
Yeah.
and not the actual, they actually do have the document there on Ancestry.com if anyone's interested, but it's very fuzzy and hard to read. So, but you can make it out if you really squint, but I didn't add it because it was so hard to read. So it's kind of neat to see that he went ahead and did that right off the bat.
That's interesting, Zora got into college, and the college she went to was Howard University, which is practically all black.
Right.
Yeah, that's an all-black school. Columbia is not,
No,
and Barnard is not. It's an all-white school.
Howard,
Yeah, it's a high-end,
I think the first maybe all black university there was.
I think you're right, yeah. Yeah. I would like to read you a quote. This is from the foreword by absolutely fantastic writer, Alice Walker. And I think it sets the stage for this entire book and the motion of the book. Alice Walker writes in the foreword, and I'll read this very slow, it's very powerful. Those who love us never leave us alone with our grief. At the moment they show us our wound, they reveal they have the medicine. Those who love us never leave us alone with our grief. At the moment they show us our wound, they reveal they have the medicine. I think this book is about the wound. That's what sets the stage. And so therefore, when Cudjo or Casola is his African name, says, I so lonely, my wife she left me since the 1908. Cudjo all by himself. Excuse me while you're being interviewed. Excuse me, I cry. I can't help it. My eyes, they stop crying. This is powerful. But the tears running down inside of me all of the time. I stop crying, but the tears run down. Our grief so heavy, look like we can't stand it. When his 15-year-old daughter died, she didn't have no time to live before she died. I think that's all the wound that Alice Walker is talking about. Cudjo's life was a life of separation and loneliness, being alone. His 6 kids died before him. Really unusual circumstances. Many of them at a very young age, in their teens. His love of his wife dies, and he's alone. And I think of my kids and my wife, and if I was alone like that, you know, I can't, I'm struggling for the words. I can't even imagine to be sitting in a town alone, separate, being a warrior at one time, laying in the cargo ship hold and living in being enslaved for 5.5 years, and then living in a Jim Crow South. I can't even, and then watching everything die around me. It's just, to me, it's very powerful.
John, speak
Yes.
to the title, if you would, how that title fits the book.
Yeah, the Barracoon is barracks, but that's a kind word. It's basically a holding barn, the same way you'd bring in cows or bulls or whatever.
Well, you know, that term coon is very derogatory often.
You know something, that's maybe where that comes from.
Yeah, I wondered about that.
I never thought
Yeah, I never
that.
thought
This is a big
It's
thing.
extremely derogatory.
Well, they,
Maybe that's where it
fortunately,
came
it's
from.
not used.
Because what would happen is when the Africans would get rounded up by other tribes, and then they would get brought to the coast. Same way you know, it's almost like the way we ship stuff. You put them in a warehouse, well, they got warehoused.
And they'd be waiting for a ship to come, and then they would sell it to the captain of the ship. I think they were sold several times. I think they first sold, maybe amongst themselves, and then again at the coast, and then again when they got to.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I would imagine they were sold maybe a minimum of 2, possibly as many as 3 or 4 times.
Yeah. Have you people read about when they would be in this country, and the way they were sold, the auctions, and it's pretty gruesome stuff. Stripped down naked again and inspected, and what have you. In fact, Abraham Lincoln, I think, in part became such a strong abolitionist because he saw one of those auction places, and to see that. Yeah.
What I don't understand is, how could you live in the South in an environment where you see this brutality day after day, and have a balanced mental attitude? attitude towards the world.
I think it's like, any place else you have atrocities, you paint the people so different than you are, that they don't belong to that same connection.
I don't think they saw them as human. I
Right.
think they
The
saw
church,
them-
the church did it during the
Inquisitions.
when they invaded Africa and so forth. And so they went around to recruit people for the Crusades. They painted them that way. Hitler painted the Jews that way. So what you do is you separate them, and then they're not like you're not considered human anymore.
Yeah, it's an interesting analogy. How did the German people stand by and say, what was happening to the Jews?
Same thing.
And they do nothing about that.
Yeah, part of that's a group ego thing too, Himmler, if you listen to what he said, I don't like killing people, but I have to do this to save my country. And they believe that.
Kind of like the African tribes were defending themselves against the neighboring tribes.
And we still do.
Yeah.
We're still doing it over and over and over.
The human being's capability to employ defense mechanisms is absolutely amazing. And there's all different types of defense mechanisms. And what we're really talking about is the use of a defense mechanism where we dehumanize. But let me show you how that plays out. Now, I'm a Vietnam era vet. I never went to Vietnam. But for all the people who went to Vietnam and those atrocities, remember what the North Vietnamese were called?
Goops.
Goops. Okay, let's work backwards. Let's go all the way to the Civil War. What did we call the Northern soldiers? What name did they give to the
Next.
Confederates?
Okay,
Rebs.
Rebs, and
Rebs.
Rebs and the Yankees, yeah.
Okay, let's jump forward to World War I. What name did the enemy have? And World War II?
Krauts.
These are all defense mechanisms. Imagine if I would have been unlucky and ended up in Vietnam like some of my high school friends were, and I'm ready to shoot someone, and I'm gonna say, oh, I'm gonna shoot a father and a husband, whatever. No, I'm gonna shoot a gook. So it's a defense mechanism, and I think that's what we're talking about here. And even our laws told us that slaves were not human, because when we counted them for the census, they were counted as 3/5. And some of us might sit back and say, well, how could a slave owner do all that damage to another human being? They weren't seen as human beings. They were seen as merchandise. Just like if you want, you can go take a chainsaw on all your bushes, and no one can do anything about it. There, you could do anything you want to your slave holdings, and no one could, because you're dealing with your own merchandise. It's a different way.
Oh, they destroyed their ship too, which is kind of
Yeah,
amazing.
tell us about that one, Marty.
Well, all I know is they burned it when they came back to just hide the evidence, and it's just been rediscovered, like
It's been
this
rediscovered
last year,
now. Yes, in the what?
in the swamp somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, would burning it, maybe they were afraid of some lawsuit or persecution by the law, because it was illegal what they had
Yeah.
done.
They
That's
were
what they
fined,
did.
they were caught, they
Oh,
were
they were
fined.
actually caught and
They
paid
were
the
caught.
fine.
But they got rid of the evidence, so maybe the fine wasn't that big, I don't know.
Well, they certainly made money still by selling off 30 pairs of slaves. Well, there's 60 left at the end or something. I can't remember the numbers.
Oh, I knew 115. Let's take a look at, let's take a look at, let's touch on the, I think.
Look at his eyes. Don't you see some wisdom in his eyes?
Yeah.
I was just thinking,
Seen a lot.
he's seeing a lot. Those would be his two grandchildren, Mary and Martha, that he references.
Yeah. Let's do the one where he's chopping wood.
Didn't he have invent a cover for his pipe?
Yeah,
Yeah, it looks
Yeah, I
that way.
remember that.
So he worked, the tobacco wouldn't come out?
Yeah.
I wondered what that looked like, I guess.
He's about, I think he's mid-80s on this
And
picture.
look at the
I think.
string that goes from his neck down to his breastbone.
Oh, I didn't notice
Yeah,
that.
what do you suppose that's?
That could be a watch.
I was wondering if that's a watch.
I bet you that's a watch. Pocket watch that he carries in his hip pocket.
Did you want me to show the video?
That little short 6-minute video
The one
where he's
her-
chopping the wood at the very
her field
beginning.
work.
This is, Zora shot this. That's him right there.
In all the big work camps, sawmills and turf camps, steel and road camps and whatnot, they have a man to go around and wake up the camp. And he has various chants and hollers to wake them up, and sometimes he makes them up as he goes along.
This is Zora Hurston footage.
Well, I heard these at Longman, a big sawmill down in
And I
Polk
think she's
County.
recording people telling stories.
Yeah.
also.
Wake up, bullies, get on the run. Think like David's 5 o'clock. Come on my net cover, bullies. Come on out my net cover unless you want some trouble with the walker. Come on. Wake up, Jacob. Days are breaking. Get your whole big of bacon in
This
your
will give you a
chest
sense
here,
of what it was like in
chicken.
1927,
Wake up, bullies, who will show? Big club game on the other side, I know you wanna go. Wake up, bullies, who will show? Big club game on the other side, I know you wanna go. Hey, you riding mules, get up, you better learn how to skin. Can't got a new job, they need 100 men.
There's going to be some other scenes
This
that
song,
she shot.
called Tampa. I've known it ever since I could remember, so I don't know who taught it to me, but I heard it sung in my native village when I was a child. Not in front of the old folks, of course. Thought I heard somebody say, you nasty but you stinky but take it away. Oh, you nasty but you stinky but take it away. I do not want it in here.
Cudjo worked at timber and sawmill.
The women in Tampa got to wash it as oh, the women in Tampa got to wash it as oh, do not want it in here. Oh, thought I heard somebody shout. Horse up the window, let the steam go out. Oh, horse up the window, let the steam go out. I do not want it in here. Oh, just I heard somebody say, nasty but stinky but take it away. Ah, nasty but stinky but take it away. I do not want it in here. This time, I'm going to sing as a Latin rhythm. And I'm going to call it Mule on the Mount, so you can start with any verse you want and give it a name. And it's the most widely distributed voice song in the United States. Captain got a mule, mule on the mount, call him Derek. Captain got a mule, mule on the mount, call him Derek.
This is what a cultural anthropologist would do. Deep South
Riding down, I got a